Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about bilingualism and ADHD. What's the impact of one on the other? So, as usual, I'll start with the take-home message. This time I'll probably be talking on the short side, closer to 20 minutes because of issues with the data, and then I'll be open to question and answer at the end. So the take-home message is that for most of the last century, the assumption was learning a second language was an extra burden on the brain, that it caused, particularly in kids, confusion, stress, difficulties. It was more likely to lead to slow development of language, mental illness, intellectual problems. And then about a generation ago, and this isn't everyone because there's still many speech pathologists and others who recommend to children of immigrants that they keep things simple and only teach their kids one language. That's a minority view, but that still exists. But about a generation ago, things switched to the other side, that bilingualism was this wonderful brain stimulating technique, and it actually increased your flexibility, your ability to ignore distractions, and that it was a brain strengthening tool. So from this arose two different possibilities. If you have ADHD as well as being bilingual, does the bilingualism create an extra burden on your brain so that things are even more challenging or difficult? Or because some of these are strengthening executive functions and how the brain controls a flow of information, and that's one of the things that seems to be impaired with ADHD, could bilingualism rescue people from ADHD? So what does the data show? The summary is the data is a horrible mess. One, there's not much of it. Two, each study is done a different way. But three, some studies show small advantages, some show small disadvantages of being bilingual on ADHD. And the biggest chunk show no clear impact. So the bottom line is we need a lot more research. Not a lot conclusively can be said, except that there does not seem to be a major detriment to learning a second language if you have ADHD. Again, that's separate from whether ADHD may make it harder to learn a second language. So jumping into so that's the take home. So jumping into it, what evidence do we have that learning a language is a burden on the brain? And I will say at the beginning of this that much of these attitudes are influenced both by our views about children and what they're capable of and what they can do or not do, and whether they're small, meager, pale imitations of adults, or whether they are, that's the older view, and whether they are tremendous learning, growing machines, and adults are just stunted versions of children. That's the more modern view. So fairly consistently, and there's nothing that's completely consistent in this field. Evidence suggests one is that it's easier to find deficits from multilingualism or bilingual by two or multi more than two in children than it is in young adults or middle-aged adults. But in children, it does seem that multilingual children, if you're testing them in the dominant language of the culture, which may be their secondary language, vocabularies tend to be smaller than monolingual kids, and there's less fluidity with language. So there's more grammatic problems, there's more pauses searching for words, and none of that's surprising. If you're trying to learn twice as many things and they're two different words can mean dog, then you may have to search farther and have more trouble finding one than the other. So that finding, and it's a finding that's also seen in kids who are developing with ADHD, that they tend to have smaller vocabularies and more trouble with the semantics of language than kids without ADHD. So there's an overlap. It looks like they're both burdened in the same way. Beyond that, there's much less extensive data. So what is the evidence, or what are the claims of bilingualism being an asset? So here I'm going to look at just the Department of Education, one of their bulletins, where they are touting the benefits of bilingualism. So the theory is that again, you can't, if you're learning two languages, you can't ever fully turn off the language you're not speaking in at the moment. And we're not just talking speaking, but much of our thinking, not all of it, but much of our thinking has a linguistic component. We're thinking in terms of words and ideas and names. And so the claim is that kids, or if you pick up a language, second language at a later point in time, you are training your brain to focus more precisely on the right language. You're making critical decisions on and about what to look at or sort through in your brain. You're making decisions about what to ignore, what's extraneous at this moment. So the claims, and the Department of Education summarizes them by claiming bilingual children have brains that are more flexible, are less distractible, are better at inhibiting responses to things that they should stop and not respond to, that they're better at abstraction, they're better at self-control, they're better at logic, they're better at remembering words or events, and they're better at decision-making. The data for this is pretty darn meager, very spotty, very inconsistent. Some evidence that some of these may be in some studies found. And connected to this is a more recent claim, and with a wealth of data actually supporting this, that the risk for dementia seems to be lower in people who have multilingual backgrounds or bilingual compared to monolingual. So this cognitive reserve, this having built up parallel systems, does seem to have some protective effect, and it's not insignificant. It's a difference of as much as 4 or 5 years in most studies in terms of the likeliest time of onset for dementia. There's some evidence that if you look at people at equal signs, a monolingual versus a bilingual person early on in elderliness, in terms of cognitive function, that there is more decline in abilities in monolingual people than in the bilingual, multilingual people. There's also evidence that if you look at degree of functional impairment in life from dementia, that someone who's bilingual probably is having much more observable shrinkage damage to their brain to get to that lower level of functioning than someone who's monolingual. So there is considerable support there for bilingualism strengthening the brains in good and protective ways. And there's actually, of all the realms that I looked at, probably the neuroscience data showing the benefits of bilingualism is probably the most robust. So and 5 different dimensions or domains. One is learning a new language seems to boost neurogenesis, making new neurons. That seems to be a good thing. I mean, there's a narrow situation, brain cancer is making new neurons. Those are aberrant neurons. This is healthy, normal neurons. That a number of studies indicate that learning a new language promotes that. So not only is it making new neurons, but these are neurons that are connecting to another neuron. So or old neurons are also connecting to others. So separate from neurogenesis, new neurons, nerve cells being made, there is evidence that learning a second language promotes synaptogenesis. So the synapses are the connections from one neuron to another neuron. That also seems to be enhanced by learning a second language. The third thing, and this is sort of a slightly higher level, is not are there just one-on-one, one neuron to another connections being made, but there is strengthening of certain circuitry and pathways. So there is functional connectivity that is enhanced or increased by learning a second language. So those are all seem good things. And again, the neuroscientific data seem to be fairly consistent, at least more consistent than all the rest of the data we're talking about today. And if you look at either white matter, so white matter are the fiber tracks, long fiber tracks in the brain, where the myelinated, insulated sheaths of the axons in the nerves. So as the nerve sends out a projection from its cell body to where other nerves it's connecting. So there seems to be enhanced white matter, so better, stronger pathways in the brain, and a at least preservation or greater amount of gray matter as well. So gray matter were the cell bodies, the nucleus, and most of the organelles, the cellular components are working. So across the board, the neuroscience would support that bilingualism is probably an asset to the brain. I mean, it certainly might depend on what task you're asking the brain to do, but overall, it's physically making brains more robust. So what is the data about bilingualism, multilingualism, and ADHD itself? So unfortunately, I mean, there's a few dozen studies out there. The most recent meta-analysis could only find 9 of those that it felt were rigorously done and meaningful results. And they looked, actually, this meta-analysis looked at 9 different aspects of executive function to see whether the existing literature supported that was being strengthened in bilingual ADHD kids compared to monolingual kids with ADHD. Most of these were kids, some of them were adults, the studies. 8, that is tiny. And when they looked at each of the 9 different executive functions they were evaluating, the only one that was actually statistically significantly better in bilingual kids compared to monolingual kids with ADHD was response inhibition. So not responding when you're given a stimulus and your testing is you should respond, but if you see this other light or this other stimuli, don't respond. Bilingual kids with ADHD did better than their monolingual kids. But all the other executive functions that they tested, whether they looked at flexibility of thought, whether they looked at distractibility, that was one of the most common things. So they're called flanker tests, where different information is presented on a screen. I'm oversimplifying here, but you're not supposed to pay attention to what's on the sides. That's whether it's in sync with what your target's looking at or going the opposite way. You know, a good measure, we think, of a distractibility, but there was no differentiation there. There was no differentiation on other forms of attention, on working memory, on any of the other aspects of executive function that were looked at. There were a few studies that seemed to see it enhanced. There were a few studies that seemed to be not so good for most of these functions, and most of the studies showed no impact. So the overall assessment from that meta-analysis was that there are not compelling reasons to avoid learning a second language if you have ADHD. It does not seem to have or place a major burden on most kids growing up or most adults who are interested enough to learn one. But the data is really spotty and meager and contradictory there. So my take home is that there are good cultural, connecting, psychological opportunities. So you are going to be open to more people if you can speak another language. You are going to learn how different cultures or subcultures view the world or interact with the world or see themselves. That's a positive. You may increase your options for work or, again, connecting with friends or other people from different cultures. So I think, from my perspective, there are a number of advantages from a cultural, psychological perspective, but the neurological assessment is pretty meager. So I'm going to launch into a little section on why is the data so bad or what's so problematic about it. So one big thing is how these studies all looked at ADHD and monolingualism or bilingualism. And almost all of them made a category decision. You either have ADHD or you don't. You either have 2 languages or more, or you don't. And in reality, we know that both of these things, that ADHD is a spectrum condition. You can have some ADHD traits, you can have a lot of ADHD traits, you can be severely afflicted with it. So if you just force everyone to be in one category or another, you're almost certainly either making it so narrow that you're only including the most severe cases, or potentially you could be making it so broad that you're muddying your potential results. So you're much more likely to find real associations if you're dealing with a condition that exists on a spectrum, if you're treating it as a spectrum condition. And similarly, monolingualism versus bilingual or multilingualism is also a spectrum condition. It's not either are you fluent in a second language or not, because some people have varying abilities. They may have a smaller vocabulary, they may be better at reading, or they can understand hearing it but can't write it. Or so there's a broad range there in terms of it is a spectrum condition, and treating it as such might reveal much more meaningful connections than just making it a categorical situation. And one of the most widely cited studies, this is just sort of an aside, not on the categorical issue, but a miscategorizing issue. So it was supposedly a study looking at monolingual versus bilingualism, Israeli study, where the monolinguals were speakers of Hebrew and the bilinguals were Hebrew and Russian speakers. But it turns out that virtually everyone in their sample was also fluent in English. So it was actually looking at a bilingual versus a trilingual or more situation, not even looking at. So particularly if you're viewing mono as a category, that whole study wasn't going to address those questions. So other important things is that there, particularly in the United States, but in most countries, there are big confounding variables with bilingualism and socioeconomic status, immigration status, racial status, educational attainment, cultural attitudes, and particularly the interaction between multilingualism and ADHD in terms of whether you're likely to get a diagnosis, whether your culture views it as differently, whether you have less resources to even be treated or assessed, or you don't even believe something like that should be treated or assessed. So all of these are potentially confusing variables that make it difficult to study. I talked a little bit about some of the differences that are seen are more easily discernible with kids, and that makes sense as they are acquiring language. It may be easier to pick out ways in which there may be differences, but by young adulthood, many fewer of the young adulthood studies could find a meaningful difference. I mean, it may be, and I'll get to the next question, well, one more. So one other confound with the data is what we call publication bias. If you have an interesting finding versus finding there's no difference between these two groups, you're more likely to get your study published. So there may well be overrepresentation in studies that show a difference than studies that don't show a difference. Interestingly, again, looking at the whole literature body, and most of this is written in English, which itself we could explore as an issue about multiculturalism and language. This is the one area in all the topics of ADHD and brain stuff in general that I've been researching, that there is most of the data, not all, but Canada is by far and away has more than American researchers. It makes sense. So two things, I'll throw in some interesting fact there. There are more bilingual Americans than there are bilingual Canadians or bilingual citizens of any country in Europe. We are used to thinking of Americans are these people who, they don't even speak English, they speak American, but don't know any other foreign languages. And about 20% of Americans, again, many of them are from immigrant cultures, but many others pick up languages for other reasons as well. And because the US population is bigger than any of these other countries by a lot, 20% of Americans make a bigger population group. So, and 20% is not insignificant, but at the forefront, multilingualism in the US hasn't been an issue. In Canada, where they have a Quebec is a French-speaking province, and how to acknowledge that or deal with that or work with that. Signs throughout Canada are bilingual. So bilingualism is a more salient factor in their culture. So one other big issue that I think, and this is neglected in all the discussions I was reading about the multilingualism versus monolingualism and ADHD discussion, is what a lousy job our executive function tests do for representing anything in daytime living really world. So I think lots of bright people have developed these tests. I think they're measuring something that's interesting, but as Russell Barkley, who's a prominent ADHD researcher and a psychologist, and has worked on developing executive function tests themselves, the executive function tests, when you look at a group of people with ADHD versus a group without, very often, even though we think executive function deficits are central to ADHD, the majority of studies don't find a substantial difference, or they find many individuals with ADHD don't score in an abnormal range on executive function tests. So it's not surprising that in the meta-analysis, almost nothing showed up as meaningfully significant in terms of an executive deficit mediating any differences between monolingual versus bilingual kids' brains and ADHD. I don't know, I hoped I said it earlier. So in that meta-analysis, the only significant difference was in response inhibition, ability to not respond to stimuli you shouldn't be responding to at that moment. So I think we need to do a lot more work on developing executive function tests that not only are meaningful in the laboratory situation, but have some real world validity. And that's about all I will say there. So I recorded the talk yesterday. I was going to post it next week, but it's already posted on the YouTube channel. I won't be back until the new year. I'll actually be immersing in multilingualism in it as I go to Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland over the next 3 weeks. So, hi, Dennis. And Dennis shared that he's bilingual in English and Spanish, which great. And again, I think being bilingual opens up a whole host of opportunities in terms of connections within yourself and connections with the rest of the world. And I don't think having ADHD should deter anyone from learning another language. And we know clearly learning a second language early in life, pre-pubertal, seems much easier to get it in there than learning at a later age, particularly learning with a genuine native-like accent. So I'm not seeing any more questions. So enjoy the holidays, whether it's winter solstice or Christmas, Hanukkah, Saturnalia, something else. Stay healthy, stay happy, and I'll be back in the new year.